Okay, so now that we've covered all the anatomy of the respiratory system, the rest of this lecture is going to be looking at all the physiology, as well as all the chemical and behavioral aspects of the respiratory system. So to start out this section, we're going to talk about the behaviors of the gases we're talking about, in this case, oxygen and carbon dioxide. And as a little bit of a recap from the last section, when we have inspiration, taking air in, we're going to have an increase in the volume of the cavity, in this case, the thoracic cavity, which houses your lungs. The muscles responsible for making this occur are going to be your diaphragm and your external intercostals. These muscles are going to contract, so your diaphragm will contract and move downward, allowing your lungs to move downward. Your external intercostals will contract, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, and the ribs will swing out of the way. Then when you expire, when you push the air out, you're going to have a decrease in the volume of that cavity. And the muscles responsible, in this case, are your internal intercostals and your abdominal muscles. So those internal intercostals will contract and decrease the volume of the cavity. The abdominal muscles will contract and push the diaphragm back up as it relaxes. And those ribs will swing back down. Again, all of this will contribute to the volume decreasing, pushing the air from the lungs out of the body. So, with all of our gases, we have several different factors to look at, first of which are pressure and volume. So we have what's called Boyle's law, and this takes into account the relationship between pressure and volume. So the formula I have here is P equals K divided by V, where P is the actual pressure, total pressure of the gases. V is the volume the gases are taking up, so the amount of space they're taking up. And then K is just a constant for any given temperature for whatever gas we're looking at. Don't worry about the constant too much. But the big idea with Boyle's law is that as the volume of a container increases, the pressure is going to decrease. So as this goes up, as your volume goes up, your pressure will go down. So they're always inverse. So you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure, you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. They always are going to move in opposite directions of one another. This comes into this idea with what's called a pressure gradient. So air always moves down the pressure gradient. It's always going to want to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. This doesn't matter what gas we're looking at, what part of the body we're looking at. It's always high pressure to low pressure. This is represented by a formula you saw last time with blood flow. In this case, we're looking at airflow, though. So F is our airflow. We have pressure at one point versus another point, and then the resistance to airflow. So this is just to highlight that the pressure gradient is based on the differences in these pressures. So with our lung pressure and our lung volume, we can measure this with a field called spirometry. And this uses a special device that's called a spirometer. And there's a lot of different things we can ultimately measure, and I'm going to break each of these down. So the first, set of things we can measure are called your pulmonary volumes. So there's four pieces of this. You have what's called your tidal volume, your inspiratory reserve volume, your expire reserve volume, and then your residual volume. Starting at the top, your tidal volume is the volume of air that you can either inspire, take in, or expire, push out with a breath. And this is, we're talking about quiet at rest breath. So not undergoing physical stress, not exercising, not undergoing emotional stress, just regular breathing like you're sitting in your chair doing now subconsciously. So that's your tidal volume. Then you have your inspiratory reserve volume, and this is the amount that the body can take into the lungs forcefully. So when you take a deep breath, that is your inspiratory reserve volume because you're forcefully inhaling that air. To go along with that, we then have the expiratory reserve volume, which is the amount of air you can forcefully push out consciously with your lungs. So when you, after you take a deep breath and then you push the air out, that, what you're blowing out, is the expiratory reserve volume. And then lastly, we have that residual volume, and this is what's left over after you do the expiratory reserve volume. So after you push all the air you can out, so you're blue in the face, you'll have a little bit left over. You'll never totally be able to get rid of all the volume of air in the lungs. There'll always be a little bit left over, and that is always your residual. So using those 4 pieces of information, we can then figure out the pulmonary capacity, which is basically the sum of 2 or more of those volumes. So I simplified these here with formulas. All of the letters are shorthand for either the tidal volumes, expiratory reserve, inspiratory reserve, etc. So you can just use the previous slide and this slide as a guide if you don't understand the initials. But the first one is your inspiratory capacity, which is IC, and that is the equivalent of adding your tidal volume, so the amount inspired and expired while quietly breathing at rest, plus your inspiratory reserve volume, which is the amount of air you can forcefully inhale. Then you have your functional residual capacity, or FRC, and that is the sum of your expiratory reserve volume, so the amount of air you can forcefully push out, plus your residual volume, what's left over in the lungs. Then you have vital capacity, and that is equal to your inspiratory reserve volume, amount of air you can forcefully inhale, plus your expiratory reserve volume, the amount of air you can forcefully exhale, plus your tidal volume, the amount you inhale, exhale at rest. Then finally, we put it all together with your total lung capacity, which is equal to everything added up. So the inspiratory reserve volume, amount you could forcefully inhale, expiratory reserve volume, amount you could forcefully exhale, your tidal volume, amount coming in and out at rest, and then your residual volume, the amount after you do that forceful exhale. So we add all those up and you get the total lung capacity for an individual. So what I have here is a graph that sort of encapsulates all those different pieces together. So on our y-axis, we have the volume in milliliters of air, and then on our x-axis, we have time. So starting with our tidal volume in purple right here, you see these little fluctuations going up and down. That is the amount of air that we're just at rest while doing quiet breathing, pushing in and out. So it's just gradually fluctuating. Then when we take a really deep inhale, we have this huge spike right here. That is your inspiratory reserve volume. So that's the maximum amount of air you can take in while inhaling. Then on the other hand, when you push the air out, you have this big dip down here. That's the expiratory reserve volume, the maximum amount you can push out of the lungs. And then you notice that the expiratory reserve volume does not go all the way down to 0 because we can't get all the air out of the lungs. We'll always have a little bit left, and that little bit left will be your residual volume. So then those are all the volumes. For the capacities, we're just adding things together. So for that functional residual capacity, that is the sum of the residual volume, what's left in the lungs, plus the expiratory reserve volume, what's forcefully exhaled. Then we have your inspiratory capacity, which is the tidal volume, the amount going in and out at quiet or at rest, plus the inspiratory reserve volume, the max amount we can inhale. Then we have vital capacity, which is the sum of the expiratory reserve volume, amount we can forcefully exhale, plus the tidal volume, the amount coming in and out at rest, plus the inspiratory reserve volume, the amount we're forcefully inhaling. And then total lung capacity is literally just adding all 4. So the residual volume, expiratory reserve, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve. So it looks like a lot, but this figure really helps out with putting it all into perspective and getting or understanding how all the pieces fit together. So a couple additional ways that we can measure lung function is first through respiratory rate. This is a little simpler. This is just the number of breaths that we take over a minute period. So in and out over 1 minute. Then we have minute volume, which is just our tidal volume. So the amount going in and out at rest times the respiratory rate. So times the amount of breaths over a minute. Then we have what's called your alveolar ventilation. And this is just how much volume of air is actually available to be exchanged over a minute period at the alveolar membrane. So a little more on a molecular level. And then in terms of vital capacity, the expiratory reserve, residual volume, and inspiratory reserve all being added up, these can be affected by a number of different attributes. So first is sex. Males tend to have larger vital capacities over females. Next is height. Taller individuals tend to have larger vital capacities over shorter individuals. Then we have activity levels. If you are very physically active or an athlete, your body is going to be much better trained to take in air. So you're going to have a bigger vital capacity versus if you are just a couch potato. Slenderness. So if you are generally leaner, you're going to have a higher vital capacity. And then lastly, with a healthy individual versus a diseased individual. So if you have lung cancer or bronchitis, or some other ailment that may affect your breathing, that's going to affect the vital capacity, how much air you can have in or out of the lungs, versus if you're just a regular healthy individual who doesn't have any sort of lung ailment. Okay, so that was all of the different ways you can measure ventilation and respiration rates. Now we're going to get a little more into the physical and chemical attributes for gases. So first, we are going to talk about partial pressure. So partial pressure is just basically the pressure that an individual gas adds in a mixture. So let's say I have a jar of oxygen, it contains oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, all in this jar. Partial pressure is just how much pressure does that oxygen contribute, how much pressure does that carbon dioxide contribute, and how much pressure does that nitrogen contribute. The oxygen will have a partial pressure, the carbon dioxide will have a partial pressure, the nitrogen will have a partial pressure. All of those will add up to the total pressure. So it's just a slice of the pressure pie, if you will. And this idea is illustrated by what's called Dalton's law. So again, if you just add up all the sums of those gases I just listed, you get the total pressure of all of the gases in the system. The system is just the container that we're looking at, so the jar in this case. But in terms of A&P, we'll be talking about the lungs. Next, we have the idea of diffusion of gases with the solubility coefficient. And this is basically how soluble a gas is in a liquid. So in terms of making this relevant, what we're talking about is how soluble is oxygen or how soluble is carbon dioxide in our blood. And that's going to ultimately affect the method of transport. So your oxygen is not that soluble in blood, which is why not a lot of it is carried in the actual blood fluid. Your carbon dioxide, however, is much more soluble in the actual fluid part of blood, not the cell part. And much more of that carbon dioxide can be carried in the fluid itself. And the major principle with this is called Henry's law. This basically just states that the concentration of a gas, however much gas we have in a liquid, so whatever gas we're looking at in our blood, is going to be based on the partial pressure, so how much pressure it contributes to the system, and its solubility coefficient, so how well can it dissolve in the liquid for whatever gas we're talking about. Then we have, lastly, what's called our diffusion coefficient, and this is just the rate that a gas, or carbon dioxide or oxygen, can move into or out of a liquid or tissue. So we're going to have oxygen moving out of the alveolar tissue into the blood. We're going to have carbon dioxide moving out of the blood into the alveolar tissue to be removed from the body. You're going to have oxygen and carbon dioxide being diffused across whatever tissues we're looking at. And ultimately, how quickly something can diffuse is going to depend, again, on that solubility coefficient, as well as how heavy the actual gas is. So with our alveolar ventilation, I talked about pressure and volume and the relationship between them, and that when we have high pressure in one area, we're going to have low pressure, or we're going to have low volume in an area. If we have low pressure in an area, we'll have high volume of gas in that area. With that idea in mind, we have two types of pressure we're going to consider. We have what's called barometric or atmospheric air pressure. This is just air pressure outside the body, so just in the air around you. And then we have your intra-alveolar pressure, which is just the air pressure in the alveoli, the smallest structure you have in the lungs. So ultimately, that is going to impact the direction that air is going to move based on this pressure-volume relationship. And if you remember, I mentioned a few slides back pressure is always going to move down a gradient. It's always going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So I have 4 general steps here. The first one is when your alveolar pressure is going to equate to your atmospheric or barometric pressure. When this happens, we don't have any high or low to move to. So ultimately, the air is not going to do anything. Air is not going to move in or out of the body. When we have, however, the alveolar pressure inside the lungs become lower than the atmosphere, we now have high pressure on the outside, low pressure on the inside, and ultimately, because we have an increase in the thoracic volume, aka the lungs are expanding, the air is going to move from the atmosphere into the alveoli through that pressure gradient. So atmosphere is high at this point, alveolar is low, we move from high to low. So air moves into the lungs. Then, after we take an inhale, that pressure again is going to stabilize and equal the atmospheric, so we're not going to have any movement of air. And then to get air out, we're going to have that alveolar pressure increase when we have all those muscles contract, like your abdominals and your internal intercostals. That will increase the pressure on the inside and make it higher than the atmospheric or barometric pressure on the outside. And because we have this decrease in volume, we'll have an increase in pressure because of that. High pressure on the inside, low pressure on the outside, air will move outside the lungs. So the big 2 concepts to keep in mind with this, in terms of recapping all that, is that pressure and volume are inverse. So when you have an increase in volume, you have a decrease in pressure. And pressure always moves down a gradient. It always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So to show what that looks like in terms of the diagram, here we have on the top left, we are between expiring and inspiring. So we're at equilibrium right now, meaning that our alveolar pressure inside the lungs is equal to our atmospheric pressure outside. So air is not moving one way or the other. When we take a breath in, we inspire, we have an increase in the volume of the lungs because those cavities are expanding, because our diaphragm's contracting, and those the thoracic cavity is increasing, allowing for the volume to increase. Because we have an increase in volume, we have a decrease in pressure in the alveoli, meaning the atmospheric pressure is higher outside. So air is going to move from the atmosphere into the lungs. Then after we complete our inhale, we will again reach a period where there is no net movement of air. So the alveolar pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure, so we have no air movement. Then when we exhale, we're going to have the diaphragm relax from the clenching abdominal muscles. The thorax is going to recoil, so those ribs will come back in. The internal costals are going to contract, ultimately decreasing the volume of the lungs. And because we know volume and pressure inverse, pressure is going to go back up. So pressure in the alveoli is going to be higher than the atmosphere, and we're going to move always from high pressure to low pressure. So the air will move from the inside of the lungs to the outside of the body. So 2 additional things that can affect ventilation with moving of air are your lung recoil and your pleural pressure. So with your lung recoil, this is just the idea that your lungs are only so stretchy. After they stretch a certain amount, they're going to want to kind of snap back to the original state. Think of it kind of like a rubber band. When you stretch it, you let go of it, it's going to originally go back to its shape. This basically just happens so your lungs don't stretch too much and then break or destroy themselves. Then you have what's called pleural pressure, and this has to do with the actual pressure in the pleural cavity between your visceral pleura and your parietal pleura. And basically the idea of this is that you'll have negative pressure, and this negative pressure is going to contribute to your lungs also expanding during the inspiration phase. So for a normal breathing cycle, so in inspiration and expiration, this figure shows 3 different graphs sort of over top of each other that I'm going to break down real quick. So the first graph you have is your pleural pressure, the pleural cavity we're talking about here. So pleural pressure on the y-axis, graphed against time on the x-axis. Second graph we have is your intra-alveolar pressure, so the pressure in the alveoli on your y-axis. and then time again on the x-axis. And this last graph we have down here is the change in lung volume in liters on the y-axis, and then again time once more on the x-axis. So during the inspiration phase, when we take air in, we're going to have that pleural pressure decrease, become more negative, which again helps the thoracic cavity to expand and allowing more air to come in. At the same time, we're going to have a decrease in the alveolar pressure because it'll be low pressure and making the atmospheric pressure high, which allows the air to come in. And then because we are breathing in, we are taking up more air, so that change in volume is going to dramatically increase. So decrease in pleural pressure, decrease in interalveolar pressure, increase in volume during the inspiration phase. Then during the expiration phase, when we're breathing out, we are going to have that pleural pressure increase, become more positive because we're having the thoracic cage close back in. Then for your intraalveolar phase, we're going to have an initial increase above the barometric pressure, but ultimately this is going to reach a point where it tips the scales and starts to drop back down. Then for your volume, you're going to have an instance where we reach a peak, we can't keep inspiring, and then we're going to exhale and push all that air out. So it's going to dramatically decrease the volume in the lungs. And of course, this is going to be a cycle, so this will continually repeat over and over and over again. So that was the breathing cycle of ventilation, and now we're looking at the actual respiration. So we're looking at the movement of gas across the membrane from the alveoli into the blood, or from the tissues into the blood. So 3 different factors that can affect our diffusion with respiration. First is our partial pressure gradients. This I already have mentioned a few times. This is just that gas is always going to move from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So in the same way that air moves high pressure to low pressure, whether it's going into the body or out of the body, partial pressure, same idea, going high to low. So if we have high partial pressure with oxygen in one area and low partial pressure of oxygen in another area, that oxygen will always go from high to low. Same with carbon dioxide. Second attribute is your membrane thickness. So the thicker the respiratory membrane, the lower the diffusion. When I showed you that diagram in the previous part of the lecture, we only had basically 2 membranes to go across. You had to go across that alveolar membrane, and then pretty much is already in the bloodstream. There are a lot of layers to it, but overall the membrane is very thin. And the idea behind that is we want to have a very thin, more porous membrane, so materials like oxygen and carbon dioxide can get across it. Because if it's very thick, then it makes it harder to get gases across, which we desperately need to have to our tissues, or we need to remove them from the tissues and get them out into the lungs and back out of the body. Lastly is your surface area. So when we have less surface area, we have a less diffusion rate. That is because we have less space which to diffuse items across. So when I showed you the major breakdown of the bronchioles, excuse me, it started out with the main bronchioles, secondary, tertiary, terminal, went all the way down to the alveoli. The reason there's so many branching structures with the bronchi is to increase the surface area. So because we'll have a greater increase in surface area, because of all those branches, we'll have an increase in the amount of diffusion we can have, meaning we can get more oxygen to our tissues. So surface area, greater surface area means greater diffusion rate. Okay, so to cover the general cycle of how your oxygen and carbon dioxide ultimately go through the gas exchange process, we're going to start here at number 1. So we have our alveoli, excuse me, here, and then the arterial end of our pulmonary capillary. So with our oxygen, P sub O2 means partial pressure of oxygen, and then P sub CO2 means partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So your partial pressure of your oxygen is 104 here, and it's 40 here, meaning it's higher, and we always go from high to low. So your oxygen is going to diffuse from your alveoli into that arterial end of the pulmonary capillary. the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45 here, and it's 40 in the alveoli. So it's always going to move again from high to low. So carbon dioxide will diffuse in. Then your blood will ultimately basically equalize out. So your partial pressure of your oxygen will match that of the alveoli, and same with your CO2. And it will continue moving down the bloodstream into the pulmonary veins, reaching the heart to then be pushed out to the rest of the body with whatever tissue we're looking at. Then we eventually get to the tissue of interest. And in this case, you'll have your partial pressure of oxygen be higher in the bloodstream than it is in the tissues. So again, we're going to move from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So oxygen will diffuse in. And then carbon dioxide is higher in the tissues than it is in the blood. So your carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues to the blood. Then once again, your partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide will equal what's in the bloodstream to what's in the tissues, allowing it to continually move through the bloodstream and return to the heart to then ultimately get back to the alveoli.